Thanks very much. So I'm going to talk today about mostly about the recent developments when it comes to faith schools and our campaigning on integrated education, on ensuring that faith schools are as open as possible whilst they exist, and ultimately moving towards an education system where faith schools don't exist at all and we just have secular, open, inclusive, fair schools. So there have been a number of recent developments which I will go into, and I'll talk about the context under which those recent developments have happened, why they've happened, and some of the consequences of them happening. So yes, first of all, I'm sure most of you will know what faith schools are, but I'll just do a very quick overview of what we mean by the term faith schools. And then I'm going to talk about this 50% cap on religious selection, which has existed for the last 9 years for new religious schools, and which the government is proposing to scrap. And integration is obviously an important factor in this whole debate. The government have claimed that the cap isn't doing very well for integration. We challenge that, and I'll talk about the figures on that, the evidence, and whether or not the government are following the evidence in introducing this policy. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the religious lobby, who have been very active over the last few years trying to have more freedom to discriminate against children, which isn't very charitable, but that's what they've been doing, and I'm going to talk about the ways that they've been doing it. And then we'll have some questions and discussion. So first things first, what are faith schools? So what we mean by a faith school is simply a school, a state-funded school. We tend to mean, of course, there are private faith schools, but when we talk about faith schools, we primarily mean state-funded faith schools that have a religious character. That's a legal designation. They are designated when they are set up with a religious character. And about a third of all state-funded schools are religious. The vast majority of that third are Christian, either Catholic or Church of England or Methodist or some other Christian designation, and only a handful are from minority religions. And I should say, actually, that not all of that third are allowed to select their pupils with reference to religion. About 16% of all schools are allowed to. So half the Church of England state schools select on faith, all of the Catholic schools select on faith, the majority of the minority religious schools select on faith, so it's not all of them. And they as it says, they have various freedoms to influence the school according to that religion. And the freedom to discriminate is really threefold. The first is the curriculum. So schools have exemptions from the Equality Act, from equalities legislation, that allow them to teach faith-based religious education. It allows them to sort of imbue the school with a religious ethos through their teaching. Now that might be through a sex and relationships education curriculum where they teach abstinence-only sex education. It might be through assemblies where they have collective worship every day, or say grace before meals. And again, it's the exemptions that they have in equalities legislation that allows them to do that and prevents other schools from doing the same. The second kind of freedom to discriminate that faith schools have is over employment. They can, depending on what kind of faith school there are, they can hire or fire or remunerate or promote people based on their religion, and that's a real thing that happens. It's very underreported, and because of the shortage of teachers, it's not something that necessarily is as prominent as it was, but you do still see incidences of teachers being under-promoted or even being fired because of their religion. And finally, the biggest freedom to discriminate is in admissions. As I'm sure all of you know, faith schools have the power to select their children based on faith. They can prioritise children of one particular religion over others. And more than that, and relevant to humanists and non-religious people, they can actually prioritise people of all faith over people of no faith. So what you often see in the admission arrangements of schools is, if it's a Catholic school, you'll have baptised Catholics prioritised first, then people that attend a different Christian church, and then you'll have people of all other faiths, and then you'll have the rest. And so the growing population of non-religious people, the majority, are barred, and effectively barred from a third of state schools in certain circumstances. So that is a little over, these three things are what makes a faith school a faith school. There are various groups alongside the BHA that campaign for the reform of faith schools, but not the abolition of faith schools. And when they say they're campaigning for the reform of faith schools, they're effectively saying that they don't want faith schools to have these kind of freedoms. And that would be a very positive thing. Obviously, religious organisations have a lot of land, they have a lot of buildings. It would be incredibly difficult in practical terms to abolish faith schools. But if we managed to eradicate the exemptions and equalities legislation, bring in various other bills to stop these things from happening, then they wouldn't be faith schools in the same way that we call them faith schools now. But anyway, onward, the 50% cap on religious selection. How many of you have sort of seen this in the news over the last few weeks? Most of you. So this is, unfortunately, the grammar school stuff is acting as a bit of a smokescreen to this. The government have said they're going to introduce grammar schools, but as part of the same green paper, they proposed to drop what we call the 50% cap on religious selection, and it's very hard to get anyone to care because they're trying to fight this grammar schools thing, which they see as more important, but actually, important though it is, we think it's significantly less important than this issue. So what the 50% cap is it was initially brought in 2007 by the Labour government, but only for a certain number of schools. A handful of schools actually only opened under the cap since then. But then in 2010, the coalition agreement set out that any new religious school could only select half of its places with reference to religion, and the other half had to be left open to local children regardless of religion or belief. This, as I say, was something that was in the coalition agreement. It wasn't underpinned by statute, there was no law, Parliament didn't have to vote on it. It was just that the government said if you want to set up a new school, it has to have half of its places, at least half of its places, open to local kids. And that's a great thing for lots of reasons. It's good for integration, as we'll talk about. It's good generally for parents' access to local schools. Many of you will be aware that if you live particularly in rural areas, all your local schools might be religious. And so parents are often left having to trek miles and miles to get their kids to school every morning. Parents are often forced to stay at home rather than go back to work because of this. And so simply having places open at these faith schools where they weren't before is just good for local access, and it's good for schools serving their communities. And generally, when you have more inclusive admissions, you have a more inclusive ethos. If the possibility exists that a child that's not from a religious background that's relevant to the school might be admitted, then you have to be more open. You have to sort of cater for them in some way, and that is good for the education as a whole. It's more open, it's more inclusive, it tends to be fairer, it's less discriminatory. You learn about other people's beliefs a bit more than you otherwise would, and so setting aside integration, just the very fact that the cap exists encourages schools to think in a more inclusive way, and that's why we think it's a very important thing in principle as well as in practice. And yeah, the last thing to say is it's obviously not enough. Schools shouldn't be able to discriminate against kids on the basis of their parents' assumed religions at all. But the 50% cap is a step in the right direction. We think it should be extended to all schools, and then as part of a sort of general process of phasing out religious selection. But unfortunately, the times dictate that we need to dig our heels in rather than necessarily try and move forward. So our campaigning is all about trying to keep this 50% cap in place at the moment. So why has the government proposed to drop the cap? Well, the first thing to say is that bizarrely they have said that the reason they're dropping the cap is because they want to promote integration in schools, and so they've said we're going to drop the cap, but we're going to introduce all these other piecemeal ways of improving integration in schools. And it's a sign of the times, really, that a government can sort of stand there, a prime minister can stand there and get away with saying that they're on the side of integration, and yet they want to allow schools to admit only children of one particular faith. So that's something that needs to be challenged and that we're challenging. But linked to this is this idea that they're trying to get across that the cap hasn't worked. This is what their green paper says. They say that whilst it is well-intentioned, it actually hasn't led to an increase in integration. And as we'll see a bit later, that is wrong. The claims they've made are incredibly misleading, and we'll talk about that. The other main reason why they've proposed to drop the cap is they say that certain religious groups can't open new schools. as a result of it. This is the religious lobby at work. Needless to say, both of these things are nonsense, and we'll see why. The religious groups have been incredibly disingenuous, incredibly misleading, as they are prone to be, and the government has been incredibly gullible, as it is prone to be. So, integration. Specifically ethnic integration is what the government focus on when they say that the CAP hasn't worked to promote integration. And what they've quite cleverly done, I mean it's not that clever, but it's vaguely clever, is say that the CAP hasn't worked to promote integration in minority religious schools. And that is largely true, for quite obvious reasons. White British parents aren't going to send their kids to Muslim schools or Jewish schools or Hindu schools, regardless of what the selection criteria are at the school, on the whole. Obviously some do, and there are quite a few Jewish schools that are very open, and they have quite a mix. But on the whole, white British parents, whether they be non-religious or Christian, aren't going to send their kids to minority religious schools. So the CAP hasn't really worked there. But the minority religious schools make up a tiny fraction of the religious schools in the country. So to justify this policy on the basis that it's not working in only a handful of schools, when, as we'll see, it's working in a huge number of schools, is really pretty nonsensical. And the other thing to say is that the CAP's only been properly in force since 2010. We have an incredibly segregated education system. We have an incredibly segregated country in lots of ways. And to think that it's somehow this CAP, which doesn't go far enough, is going to work in just 6 years, and if it doesn't, we're going to drop it, is mad. And the other thing that, as I say here, it hasn't done any harm. So if it's working in other schools, but it's not working in some schools, that's not a reason to drop it. The CAP can exist in these minority religious schools and do no harm while it works in other schools. But yes, this is the important point, because I'll just go back before showing you that. The government say that it hasn't worked, and as I've said, it has worked, and this is the proof. What we have here, the blue is free schools, and the red, that's free schools that have opened under the CAP, so free schools that are subject to this 50% cap, and the red are faith schools that select all of their places with reference to religion. And this is the proportion of Asian pupils in those schools, and you'll see that for Church of England schools and for other Christian schools, other Christian is just a designation for non-Anglican schools, the proportion of Asian pupils in the schools that have opened under the CAP is significantly higher. I mean, if you look here, this is 3% of pupils at fully selective other Christian schools are Asian. When the CAP is enforced, it grows to nearly a fifth. And so those free schools that have opened under the CAP are incredibly more diverse than the schools that existed before. They're incredibly more integrated in ethnic terms. And so for the government to say that it hasn't worked, when you can clearly see it's worked really quite remarkably well, given that it's only been 6 years, is disingenuous and incredibly misleading. And a similar graph, this one's laid out slightly differently. These are fully selective schools and the proportion of white British pupils that are in them, and these are the ones that have opened under the CAP. And it's slightly less clear difference, but you can clearly see that these schools are far more whitewashed than the schools that have opened under the CAP. Again, proof that the CAP has worked remarkably well in boosting ethnic integration in schools. So what the government have done is ignored this. They've simply, it's really pretty bad science, they've just published the ethnic diversity stats of free schools, and by no measure, by no comparison, they've said that they're not very good, and said, well, that shows that the CAP's not working. But as we have showed here, it is working, and so we're trying to encourage people to look at the stats that they should be looking at rather than the stats that present the misleading picture the government are trying to spin. The other thing to say, which again a lot of you might know, is that religious selection always results in socioeconomic selection too. In other words, whenever religious selection is used at faith schools, poorer kids have less access to those schools. This is not something that is necessarily the intention of these faith schools when they select, but it is something that happens, and they know it happens, and yet they continue to select anyway. And so what we did is we compared the free school meal eligibility which is not the best measure in the world, but it's the best measure we have for deprivation and for poverty. And we compared the proportion of pupils at schools that were eligible for free school meals to the proportion of pupils in the school's local area that were eligible. And if a school was doing right by its community, you'd expect those proportions to be largely the same. They were catering for all the kids in a representative way. Unfortunately, religiously selective schools don't do that, as we will see here. So this is a bit of a complicated table, but what we have here is the difference in proportion of poorer pupils at schools. So you will see that at Roman Catholic schools, which I said earlier, all of them select all of their places with reference to religion. At secondary level, they have 24% fewer poorer children than they should given their local areas. At primary, 32%. And you get down here and you look at the Jewish schools, 75% fewer kids, poorer kids than they should given their local areas at primary level. And the picture's the same across the board. And one of the I think the most interesting thing about this is that it's often said, bizarrely, by religious groups in response to this, that religious people tend to be better off than non-religious people, for which they obviously have no evidence at all. But we can refute that. We can sort of refute the claim that faith schools in and of themselves will always have more affluent children because religious people are more affluent, by looking at the stats for Church of England schools that are completely open in their admissions and Church of England schools that select all their places on religion. And you can see that actually Church of England schools that don't select are pretty representative of their local area. They actually take more kids that are from poorer backgrounds than they should given their local areas. They're very inclusive. As soon as they start religiously selecting all their places, they take 31% fewer poorer kids than they should given their local areas. So there is nothing sort of intrinsic to a faith school that bars poorer kids from going there. It's only when they introduce religious selection. And so that is another part of this 50% cap debate. Irrespective of questions of ethnic and religious diversity, if you allow these schools to suddenly become religiously selective, poorer kids are going to have less access to their local schools. And this is a map. Again, many of you might be aware, we set up something called the Fair Admissions Campaign. I sit on the steering group of the Fair Admissions Campaign. And a couple of years back, we set up this, which is a map of every secondary school in the country. And you can click on these things, and it will show you how inclusive it is in socioeconomic terms, and how religiously selective it is. It's quite a useful tool. That's just the Fair Admissions Campaign website. Now, that gives a sort of quick overview of why this 50% cap proposal, or the decision to drop the 50% cap, is going to be so disastrous for integration, not just along ethnic lines, but along socioeconomic lines too. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got there. And it's the religious lobby again, unfortunately. So this is a blog that we put up on our website, Faith Schools Anonymous, 5 ways the Catholic Church misled the government into a U-turn on faith school admissions. And I'm just going to quickly run through what those 5 ways are, and they actually give, well, they're quite effective in sort of busting the myths around faith schools and the kind of responses that you'll get if you say to someone that if you say to someone you don't think faith schools are a good idea, they tend to say lots of things like, oh, it's about choice, or they're very popular, and we're going to run through those because these are all the things that the Catholic Church and others have been spinning in order to lead to this proposal. So the first, this is mad, really, but the Catholic Education Service have said that they can't open new schools because it breaches canon law for them not to discriminate against children, which is lovely. And Theresa May has just gobbled it up, and this is what she said. She said, the 50% cap prevents new Catholic schools opening because the Catholic Church believe it contravenes its own rules for a Catholic bishop not to prioritise the admission of Catholic pupils. Will remove the 50% cap to allow the growth and capacity that Catholic schools offer. So she's drunk the Kool-Aid, so to speak, that the Catholic Education Service has been serving. Now this is so transparently bollocks. That it's quite depressing, really, and for these reasons. First of all, the majority of Catholic private Catholic schools in England don't select any of their most of their places on religion. Many of them don't select any of their places on religion. And if you go on the website of Catholic private schools in England, you'll see comments like, part of our strength is our diversity. We admit children from all sorts of different backgrounds. We're just as welcoming to non-religious children and minority religious children as we are to Catholic children. And they're very proud of the tradition of diversity that they have sort of espoused for a long time. So to say that it's against canon law for them to do this is obviously not true, unless all of these private schools are breaking canon law, which I suppose is a possibility. The other thing is that some state Catholic schools in England don't select. So the Catholic Education Service, the Catholic Church in England and Wales, already allows quite a few state-funded Catholic schools not to select all of their places on the grounds of religion. So to say that they can't set up any more that do that because of canon law, again, is either true and these schools are breaking canon law, or it's rubbish. Again, most state schools in Scotland, state Catholic schools in Scotland, don't select on religion. Canon law might be different in Scotland as it is here, but I suspect it's not. And we are actually, the UK, is actually only one of 4 countries that are identified by the OECD that allows state schools to select in this way at all. The others are Israel, Estonia, and Ireland. So it's an incredibly rare thing to allow this. We take it for granted here. Religious selection is part of the furniture in this country, but actually it's incredibly rare around the world. And again, it's possible that canon law is different in other parts of the world, but I suspect it's not. And in any case, who cares? It's crazy that the Prime Minister can stand up and justify a policy that will introduce more discrimination and more segregation to the education system because certain religious groups are not happy to cater for all children in a community when they open schools using public funds. But that's the situation that we're in. And if you replace the word canon with Sharia, you can imagine the kind of uproar there'd be. And rightly so. But unfortunately, even though Catholics make up just 9% of the population, and even if they made up half of us, even if they made up 90% of us, it still wouldn't justify bringing in this policy because it contravenes a religious law. We unfortunately don't live in a particularly secular country. So that is the first sort of sneaky way that the religious lobby has managed to bring this about, and the government have lapped it up, as I've said. The second is diversity in Catholic schools. So the claim here is that Catholic schools are very ethnically diverse. Now, in some ways, it's not true at all, actually, but you can argue that it's true because there is quite a lot of ethnic diversity within the Catholic faith. The sort of Afro-Caribbean immigrants are very Catholic, more so than any Anglican immigrants, which isn't really a thing. So, yes, if you compare Catholic schools to Church of England schools or to other Christian schools, they can be more diverse because of the diversity within the Catholic faith. But what we've already seen is that, irrespective of that, less religious selection equals more ethnic and socioeconomic diversity. So even if Catholic schools are more diverse than some very low benchmark, if you allow them to select more, they'll just become less and less diverse. So it's not an argument really at all. And of course that is to say nothing about religious diversity. I personally think that religious diversity is the most important kind of diversity, and religious integration is more important than ethnic integration, because we're talking about what people believe rather than just sort of the colour of their skin or the culture that they come from. And so you can be as diverse as you want within a religion, but if kids aren't interacting with Muslims and with Jews and with Hindus and with Sikhs, then you're really not getting anywhere. And so far the Catholic Church hasn't claimed that their schools are religiously diverse, although maybe they will soon. Now, that moves us on to the third thing that the Catholic Church has been spinning. And I'm talking about the Catholic Church a lot because they have been the main lobbyists on this, but other religious groups have been doing the same. And the claim here is that faith schools are more successful. Everyone would have heard this. Parents like faith schools because they perform better than other schools, and that's because of the religion. This sort of slightly offensive idea that the ethos of a religious school makes it perform better, and that a secular school can't perform along the same lines because of its lack of a religious ethos. The evidence on this is actually quite clear, that it's not faith schools that are more successful, it's religiously selective faith schools that are more successful, or tend to be more successful. And that is purely because of the kind of selection we talked about earlier. They admit more affluent kids with sharp-elbowed middle-class parents that can pay for tutoring or tutor the kids themselves, or are more motivated, or are more educated themselves. And so that socioeconomic selection, for which religious selection acts as a proxy, is the reason why these schools sometimes perform better. And Gibbons and Silver are two of the most prominent education academics in the country, and they say that there's no unambiguous performance advantage that cannot be attributed purely to pupil-side sorting into faith schools, or to school-side selection of pupils likely to show the fastest progress. In other words, these schools are selecting more affluent children, and that's why they're performing better. And so we did some number crunching on this a couple of years ago. In fact, we do it every year. Whenever the league tables come out, the GCSE league tables that the Sunday Times publish, there's always an article that follows. It tends to be in the Telegraph or the Mail or the Express, saying, oh look, faith schools are fantastic, let's stop this demonisation of faith schools, they perform best. And you can see why 47% of the top performing 100 comprehensive schools last year were faith schools, and that bucks the trend, because only a third of schools are faith schools, and they say, as I've said, that means faith schools are more successful. But if you look at the intakes of these schools, as we did, they take on average 44% fewer children from poorer backgrounds than they should, given their local areas. And when you sort of shrink the size of that 47, you take just the top 10, that figure becomes 56% fewer. And then if you look at the top 5, there we go, Tawhid Islamic Girls High School, 64% fewer poor kids. The next one, 78%, 77%. I mean, these are grammar schools by the back door. They simply select the most affluent kids, and their performance is attributable almost entirely to that. So to say, as the religious lobby has, that faith schools are better performing is simply wrong. That's a little blank screen for some reason. Oh yeah, so these are the last two, which I'll take together. New faith schools are needed to meet demand. That isn't true, as we'll see, and new faith schools are popular. These are kind of linked, as you'll see. So the first thing to say is that, as everyone knows, the country is getting more and more non-religious, and the number of religious people is shrinking, or at least the proportion of religious people is shrinking. And that is actually something that is set to continue when we leave the European Union. I still haven't got over it. When we leave the European Union, because a lot of, especially Catholic congregations, are supported by immigrant populations, and that is why actually you've seen less of a drop-off in the Catholic Church than you have in, say, the Anglican Church, because they are sustained by immigrants. So, as I say, we are getting more non-religious. This is actually quite an interesting graph. You see on the left the census, which asks the appalling question, what is your religion? It's a leading question, and it leads lots of people to just put Christian because they were brought up Christian or they went to a Christian school. But when you ask the less leading question, do you regard yourself as belonging to a particular religion, you get a much more representative idea of what the country believes. So always look at the British Social Attitude Survey rather than the census. And the advantage of this is it comes out every year, and obviously the census is just once every 10. And this is a little graph, again, showing the same thing. The red is us, I assume most of us, swelling in numbers all the time. This is the Church of England, the poor Church of England, that are hemorrhaging parishioners from every pew. And as you see, this green line here, is that green? Is the Catholic Church. And as I say, there's a little drop-off, but they are being sustained by immigration, and that's something that is set to change. Sorry, this is incredibly fuzzy, but I'll explain what it is. The red line is the number of people that attend a weekly Church of England service. The blue line is the number of kids in state-funded Church of England schools. And so for the first time this year, there are now more pupils attending compulsory collective worship in Church of England schools every day than there are people voluntarily attending Church of England services each week. So the idea that we need more faith schools to cater for demand isn't true. I said voluntarily attending church services each week. There are, of course, lots of parents that are forced to attend church services to get their kid into the local school. So not all of that, just under 1 million, is voluntary. So yes, that's sort of the demand side. The popularity side is a complex picture. If you ask people various questions that relate to their support of faith schools, you see that they're not actually that popular. 42% is a very low number. There was a huge number of don't knows in this particular poll, but 42% was a lot higher than the number that were in favour of faith schools. 72% oppose religious selection in schools. So even if you like faith schools and you think that they contribute to choice or whatever it is, most people think that religious selection and religious discrimination in admissions isn't a good idea. 50% think we've got a divided country, and the 66% of Muslims that would choose a faith school, wouldn't choose a faith school if they could, is really important, because the image that we get of the minority religious communities in this country is that they want to silo themselves off. They're the ones that are sort of self-enforcing this segregation. And there's not much we can do about it. This isn't true. Most minority religious communities want to be educated in secular schools. They want their children to be educated with kids from other different backgrounds. And unfortunately, we don't represent that as well as we should. Now, the other thing about popularity is when you say that faith schools are popular, and when lots of parents apply to them and you use that as a measure for popularity, what you have to demonstrate, and this is something people often miss, is that these people are applying to these faith schools because they're faith schools. And that is almost always not the case. So when you ask parents, this is a poll I think from 2010, why they choose a school, you'll see that the religion of the school is less than 10%. And they were able to choose 3 factors here, and obviously they chose the performance of the school, where it is, all that kind of stuff, that, you know, the reasons that we all know parents choose schools. So the idea that there is a lot of demand for faith schools is wrong. There's demand for good schools and local schools. There's not demand for faith schools. And the same thing is demonstrated here, 5% for grounding of pupils in a faith tradition, 3% for transmission of belief about God. So, again, if anyone ever says to you, oh, but my local faith school's really oversubscribed, but most parents want to send their kids to a faith school, then say no, because as these polls show, they're actually just looking for a local school, a local good school, or a school that has good discipline, or their friends send their kids there, all the usual reasons that people send their kids to schools. So just a little recap of that. The title of my integrated education is under attack. It really is. This 50% cap removal is bad in practical terms, as we've seen. It's going to be retroactive, I should have said earlier. All the schools that have opened in the last 6 or 7 years under the cap are going to be allowed to select all their places, which is disastrous for the progress that we've made. But of course, as I said as well, it's the principle. If you encourage schools to be more open in their admissions, you're encouraging to be more inclusive in their outlook and in their ethos. And the message that the government is sending when they say to a school, you can admit only children of your religion, is a very dangerous one, and it has quite far-reaching implications. As I've said, the 50% cap does boost integration, and you can go on our website and find all of this data and all this information and various briefings that explain that. Some faith schools do perform better than others, but that's only due to religious selection. There isn't demand for more faith schools at all. This is the thing that actually now the government is talking more and more about, that they've slightly climbed down on talking about integration because they know they're wrong and they don't feel they can get away with saying it so often, but they keep spouting this idea that there's demand for faith schools, that people write to the government to say they want a faith school in their area, which just isn't true. Faith schools aren't popular, as I've said, and the religious lobby is sneaky. My last slide is really to demonstrate that religious selection and discrimination in admissions is kind of a separate issue from faith schools. And this is something that we've been trying to hammer home, because we need to build as wide a coalition on this 50% cap as we can. But whatever you think about faith schools, and lots of religious people, for understandable reasons, like faith schools, that doesn't mean that you have to like the idea of these schools being able to discriminate against children. And that doesn't mean you need to like the idea of these schools being very sort of monochrome in their religious makeup. Lots of people that like faith schools want those schools nonetheless to be integrated. They want their kids to be able to mix with people from different religious or non-religious backgrounds. And so what we've seen, in fact I've got 2 emails today from local vicars saying that they supported everything we do when it comes to this 50% cap, is trying to sort of bust the myth that you have to be a humanist or an atheist or a secularist. Well, you have to be a secularist, a humanist or an atheist or a non-religious person to oppose the repeal of this 50% cap. That isn't true. Lots of religious people oppose it too, and that's always worth reminding people of. And I'll leave you with a quote here. This is from, well, I won't tell you who it's from yet, but I'll just read it out. "I do not see how any man wishing well to the public peace and who looks to Ireland as his country can think that peace can ever be permanently established or the prosperity of the country ever well secured if children are separated at the commencement of life on account of their religious opinions. I do not know any measure which would prepare the way for a better feeling in Ireland than uniting children at an early age and bringing them up in the same schools, leading them to commune with one another and to form those little intimacies and friendships which often subsist through life. Children thus united know and love each other as children brought up together always will, and to separate them is, I think, to destroy some of the finest feeling in the hearts of men." That was a Catholic bishop in 1850 called Dr. James Doyle in in Ireland. And so, sorry?
What was the name of the
James Doyle. James Doyle. Yeah. I mean, you can see how far we've come since then. Not very, unfortunately. But, as I say, it demonstrates that you don't have to be a humanist or a non-religious person to think that the government's latest proposals are a pretty terrible idea. And that is that. We'll go to questions and discussion.
I heard that I think it's in Wales or somewhere in the UK, non-Catholic children were barred from publicly funded school buses. And I just wondered, sorry, as a kind of second prong to that question, is there any kind of form, including the census, where it is actually compulsory to say what religion you are? Or can you on those forms say, prefer not to say? Because that's kind of would make it seem even more glaring, the fact that you have to say whether you're a Catholic or not in order to board a bus. Sorry, what did you have to say?
Yeah, so the school transport thing is a very long-running bit of discrimination in our education system. The idea behind it is that because parents have a right, supposedly, to send their kid to a faith school, if they don't have a local one, they might have to travel some distance to get their kids to a faith school. And so the idea is that a council will give them free transport to facilitate this. The opposite isn't true for parents whose only local schools are religious schools, unfortunately. There are no atheist buses. And this is something that they're clamping down on a lot. In fact, pretty much all councils now are withdrawing funding from these buses because they are so discriminatory. You really actually only very rarely see cases of kids getting turned away. In the most extreme examples, you have kids that have got into these schools, these religious schools that maybe are a bit far away from them, and they're not allowed to board the bus with their Catholic peers at the school, which is unbelievable. But that is something that's changing, and councils are happily moving away from that. In terms of the forms, I don't think there's any sort of uniform picture across the country. Most forms now do have, I don't want to specify as an option, but I'm sure there are some that don't have that.
So why should you education?
Well, but precisely, yeah.
Thank you.
So who are we up against, and why are they? What's their motivation? So what's the stakeholder map? Who's against? Obviously the religious lobby, but who? And is it politicians wanting votes, or just give us an idea of who's invested in it?
So in general, it is quite hard to get parliamentarians to speak out about faith schools because pretty much all of them have faith schools in their constituencies, and even if they want to talk about reform of them, that's seen as an attack on religion, or at least it's played out by the religious lobby as an attack on religion. So I wouldn't say that. I mean, obviously there are some parliamentarians that are the enemy, but for a lot of them, it's just inaction that's the enemy. They have to get re-elected. They feel very beholden to religious groups to do that, and so they don't come out as strongly as they might if that wasn't the case. And that is why we see the House of Lords being much more opposed to faith schools than the House of Commons, because they don't have to get re-elected. In terms of who we're up against for this 50% cap specifically, as I've said, it is the religious lobby, especially the Catholic Education Service and the Jewish lobby. I didn't mention the Jewish groups much, but they have been incredibly vocal on this. The Office of the Chief Rabbi has been having private dinners with Theresa May and with the Education Department to get this to happen for months, and they've said that they want only to set up Jewish schools that provide completely immersive Jewish environments. So they are very openly opposed to integration in their schools, and so it's mainly the Catholic and the Jewish organisations that we're up against there. But then, probably more important than all of those things is the new Chief of Staff at number 10, Theresa May's new Chief of Staff, is a guy called Nick Timothy. He was the director of the New Schools Network, which was responsible for facilitating the opening of free schools as part of the government's free school programme. And for the last few years, he's probably been the most vocal opponent of the 50% cap, partly because he's Catholic himself. I don't know how much of a motivation that is for him, but also just because of the nature of his organisation. His organisation is about facilitating the opening of free schools, and because the Catholic Education Service said they couldn't open new schools whilst this cap was in place, he was opposed to it. He has now left the New Schools Network, he's become Chief of Staff to Theresa May, and he has insisted on this 50% cap being dropped. So number 10 really is the enemy in all this. We can talk to the DFE all we like, but education policy at the moment is being run out of number 10, and that's really the big obstacle.
Slide over here.
You implied at the beginning of your talk that there's no sort of legal basis for the introduction of the 50% cap in the first instance. Could you expand on that?
Good question.
But just adding on, just as a comment, I think a lot of the things in the Green Paper, not only this, but grammar schools, universities, etc., doesn't necessarily, may not necessarily come to fruition. So do you think this also will come to fruition or not?
Yeah, good question. So the grammar school stuff will require parliamentary approval. There's going to need to be a change in legislation if they want to go the whole hog with their grammar school proposals. And so there is a possibility that it will get defeated in Parliament. Unfortunately, the 50% cap is just a government policy that has been enforced over the last few years. The coalition agreement, as I said, set out that any new religious school would have to leave half of its places open to local kids, regardless of religion. And that is it. So if a school applied to the DFE and said we want to select all our places on religion, the DFE would just say no, it's got to be half. That's all it is. It's not underpinned by any statute. There's no legislation at all. So the government could tomorrow change this simply by approving a school that was fully selective. That is a big problem, and it makes it very hard for us to challenge this. Be honest, I mean, it's easier to challenge the grammar schools thing because you can mobilise Parliament and actually get them to vote on this. It looks like the government aren't going to have a vote on this at all. They'll get to the end of the consultation and then they'll make their minds up, and it'll happen overnight. So that is a big problem. The other aspect of this is that the way schools are now set up, academies and free schools, is by what are called funding agreements, and those are just contracts between the Department for Education and the school, the governing body of the school, the trust. And so when I said earlier that this is going to be retroactive, what will happen now is that various religious schools will come to the DFE and say, we want this cap dropped in our contract. The DFE will say, yeah, fine, let's change the contract. If in however long, if assuming the cap is dropped and we get this whole new generation of schools that are fully selective, religiously selective, and then a future government wants to come in and reintroduce the cap, that might be very difficult because they are just one party to a contract. And if the school says, I don't want to play ball, I want to keep my full selection, then that just becomes a contract dispute between two parties. And so not only is this something that's very easy to change now, it could be something that's very difficult to change back in the future, just to depress you all a bit more.
My background is perhaps unusual for a gathering like this. I'm an ex-priest, and therefore, given the duties involved with that, I'm also an ex-chair of a faith school, and I'm now a teacher. I've also lived in countries under Sharia law, so I've got a fair experience.
Yeah.
First, I want to ask you about the financial implications, because when I was chair of governors, I can't remember now because it was a long time ago, but we had to find 10 to 15% of any projects, capital projects or extras, over and above the funding that we got from the state. So the state funding, as I say, I can't remember, was 85 or 90%, but it wasn't 100.
90, yeah.
90.
Yeah.
Now, where I was a priest, virtually all of the primary education was provided by by church schools. When I was there, we had one major capital project that cost 350,000. We had to find, we had to find 100,000, so it was a major project, you see, major extension and equipping and so on. That's just one small school.
Yeah.
Within the neighbouring parishes, every parish had a faith school. If every school then decided to have extensions or improvements, the knock-on effect to council taxes would have been substantial. Part of this is, from the humanist point of view, we have to be honest and say actually what you're proposing and what we want has a major effect on people's pockets, just at a time when people's pockets are going to be hit anyway in the next couple of years or so. So I'm just really wondering what work is being done to find out what the implications are on someone's tax liabilities, if you like, what the extras are that the government is going to have to find.
Yeah. So this 10% of capital funding, initially actually, the current sort of arrangement we have for the education system was introduced in 1944, and back then I think it was 50% of capital funding that the church groups had to find themselves. Now it's only 10%, and to be clear, that's of capital projects, as he says. So it amounts to about 1%, 2% of the school's budget. I mean, it depends on what kind of projects they've got going on, but it is just the capital funding. So it's not a huge amount as it is, but that is for maintained schools, i.e. local authority maintained schools, the sort of old kind of schools, non-academies. Academies don't have to pay any of their capital funds. So a church that sets up a free school gets all of its money from the state. And so, yeah, exactly, yeah. So that's the situation now. That's the other thing, is that, already part of, again, to go back to 1944, part of the rationale for allowing the church to run schools that didn't cater completely for their own communities and that could discriminate in these kind of ways was that they put up some of the funding. And that has become less and less true, as I've said. And so now we have a situation with academies and free schools where they provide none of the funding, and they're still allowed to discriminate in this way. So, the impact of getting rid of faith schools now is actually becoming slightly easier because they contribute less and less. But even before free schools and academies, they weren't contributing much. The main cost of getting rid of faith schools would be in the fact that these churches own the buildings and the land, which we'd have to buy off them, or we'd have to, I don't know how it would work. It's a very difficult thing. The church would have to give them back to us or lease them to us. But the practicalities of taking faith schools away from faith groups isn't something we're going to have to worry about for some time. But yeah, that's a bit of a bumbled answer. But yeah, the basic premise is that they don't pay that much towards the cost, and so it doesn't really make a difference on council taxes now as it did.
Well, like I say, it would depend on the area that the schools are in. Like I say, where I used to be, very intense grouping of primary and indeed 1 or 2 secondary schools that were of faith foundation. And it was a poor area.
Yeah.
And the knock-on effect for that group, admittedly it may not be a national problem, but for that group...
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Where an area with a cluster of religious schools is more problematic.
Yes, you were saying earlier that or dismissing the grammar school issue, but when John Humphreys was interviewing one of the grammar school heads, he was going through the same sort of statistics as you were here, of they were only taking a small fraction as a proportion of their local area's free school meal eligible pupils, and doing something very similar. If this is all tied in a green paper, does it not mean that if we could overthrow the whole sort of premise of Theresa May's education reform, that it would go, or is it something that could be independent?
It goes back to the question earlier. It is independent. The consultation is split into 4 parts, I think. There's things about independent schools supporting state schools, there's universities sponsoring state schools, there's grammar schools, and there's faith schools. And so even if the government was defeated on grammars, they could still push through the faith school thing. It's not one package that is either taken or left.
Whilst I've got the microphone, I think it's interesting that the previous Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, who we used to think was terrible, has turned out to be rather a bit better, and not supporting grammar schools and not voting for Brexit, I think, as well. So she's quite interesting, isn't it?
It's a sign of the times that we're harking for the days of Morgan and Gove. Although, she's not supportive on the faith school side. Yeah.
Your outlining of the current situation has made me realise that this is a bit of a hypothetical, really. But as a matter of principle, do you think that the government have a right to enforce regulations on curriculum and admissions in independent schools, or is this just a case of state funding for you and that principle rather than children and their education?
Yeah, so the question's about how much regulation there is of private schools. Is that right?
Or how much right you think the government has to regulate?
The government, has all the freedom in the world to regulate private schools. There are lots of countries that regulate private schools far more than we do. Here, we don't do it very much at all, because the government, the sort of prevailing opinion is that parents should have the right to bring up their children however they like, and that obviously doesn't require the state to pay for that, but it requires the state to give them the space to do that. And of course that has limits, although the limits aren't quite as tight as they should be. So we have very little private school regulation, and that's why you often see Ofsted reports of religious schools, sort of pointing out some appalling things, and these schools continuing to exist. Private schools are allowed to teach creationism. Private schools are allowed to teach the doctrine of the church that same-sex relationships are sinful and that same-sex marriage can't be equated to heterosexual marriage. They're allowed to do all these kind of things because we just have no regulation at all. The government could come in and say, we're going to bring private school regulation in line with state school regulation, and anything that state schools can't do or can do will be replicated in private schools. But it's not going to do that, unfortunately.
It was just that you mentioned earlier about how private schools often don't have the same admission criteria as state schools. I went to an independent, I'm not sure how representative this is, an independent school that was Anglican, although they had no religious discrimination in their admissions process. It was certainly a very large part of the curriculum, and so as someone from a non-religious background, in fact my parents aren't religious, you're still sort of being put in a situation, and kids are being put in a situation where your education is directed very much by the church.
Yeah, that's right. And in fact, some of the protections, they're called protections, and they're completely inadequate, that are built into the state school system for parents and kids that find themselves in faith schools that they don't necessarily share the faith of, don't exist in private schools. So in state schools, you can opt your child out of religious education, you can opt your child out of collective worship. In private schools, you can't do that. The assumption is that you have made the choice to send your kid there, and so there's no need to offer an opt-out. And so you do find lots of people like yourself, like me, who have to sit through chapel and things like that, and very doctrinaire religious education lessons, and just suck it up, unfortunately.
Thanks. And maybe this might be a quite unwelcome question, but just to play devil's advocate slightly, I've been going to, just as it happens, quite a few of these similar themed events in the past couple of weeks. One was at Southern Humanists now, and there was a debate there. This house believes that the state should not fund faith schools or something like that, and a few other events as well. And I asked the same question there. I couldn't really sort of get an answer, but I do think it may be quite important. My question is about strategy and priorities. So given the priorities of the country at the moment, sort of the needs of the country, and the priorities that the BHA are facing, how far high up the priority do you think it is to focus on faith schools? I mean, I don't mean to say they're not important, but say if you want, by some figures, 1/3 to 1/4 of children in London live in poverty. Humanist values and trying to change the country on those lines, from progressive activist perspective and so on. I think whether or not it's within the BHA, I think someone else may ask that question, and I think quite rightly, and I've asked it myself as well. And for example, even the state funding, so that was Andrew Copson and Marilyn Mason, and then another on the opposition for that debate in Southern Humanists was Christian representatives, faith school proponents, and it evolved into a debate about whether faith schools are good or bad, which wasn't the motion for that meeting, which is one thing. Another thing is it can just be solved by, or just have better faith schools that, for example, take in more children with representative of the local free school meal eligibility. So all of the arguments that I've sort of heard, I've not been following this for years and years, but just really in the past couple of months, could seem to be negated by just have better faith schools, or have better run faith schools, or have the government regulate them better. The government regulates banks, or tries to, or other private sector individual entities. Could do that there?
So this, that goes back a little bit to what I said at the beginning about what makes a faith school a faith school. If we were to arrive at a situation where a school was still being run by a religious group, but it couldn't select on religious grounds, it couldn't discriminate in its employment on the basis of religion, it had to teach a broad, balanced and objective religious education curriculum, it couldn't have denominational collective worship, it had to teach nationally set sex and relationships education, and it couldn't sort of espouse an ethos that was overtly religious, then that would not be a faith school, that would be a school in which religious people worked. And so, yes, we obviously campaign for religious schools to be better in terms of not better in terms of their performance, but in terms of inclusivity, etc. But that's always been our focus. We have this long-term aim of having no faith schools, no designated faith schools, because actually we think the label in itself is exclusive. Regardless of how inclusive the school claims to be, if you have a school in your area which is designated with a religious label, that automatically breeds a bit of exclusivity and division. But ultimately we're aiming for the repeal of the freedoms that they have to discriminate.
Does the value added by focusing on this issue and not other issues?
So the second. I mean, of course, maybe I shouldn't be saying this given my job, but of course there are more important issues in the world, and that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But we are a charity with a specific remit, and we do work on other things. You know, I mean, it may be that there are more important things within our work. Getting sex and relationships education compulsory in schools, I think, is incredibly important. Women's sexual and reproductive rights is incredibly important. Freedom of religion and belief around the world and stopping the persecution of atheists is incredibly important. Stopping FGM is incredibly important. All these things are incredibly important, and you know, it's up to people to decide whether they're more important than this or not. But we are a specific religious, not religious organisation, a specific. A specific charity with a very specific remit, and I think to say that we should maybe be focusing on other things is like saying that the guide dogs should be raising money for cancer research, because that's what I mean. There are different charities that do different things. It's important that these things are campaigned on in the round, and of course it's up to people to decide where they put their money and where they dedicate their time.
I was just wondering if there's been any research on the actual effect of religious schools on pupils. Yeah. Because, I mean, actually my own experience is a bit counterintuitive in a way, because I went to a very religious school. It was a cathedral school, in fact, and I would think 90% of the intake were Christians, and about 60% of the outtake were atheists. Yeah. I mean, so in a sense, although it was a very religious school, it was almost an atheist generator, really. So I wondered if is that just me, or is there something of that kind of effect?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually something that I think that sort of our opponents should say more, is that we talk about faith schools and the fact that there are more kids than ever before being educated in faith schools, and yet there are more non-religious people, and so they're obviously not working. But unfortunately, what we say to that is that there are lots of faith schools that don't push the religion as much as some of the bad ones, some of the horror stories that you read in the papers. But those faith schools give cover to the schools that do want to indoctrinate, and they do want to divide and isolate. And you can't just have the good schools, because the broadly inclusive schools are the ones, as I say, that insulate those ones. And as long as we have the legal freedoms that allow them to be exclusive and allow them to discriminate, there are always going to be bad schools that fail children in quite big ways. So even if the overall trends tell us that faith schools aren't working, that doesn't stop individual schools from trying and from dividing communities and from wrecking children's lives.
Sorry, just from my perspective. When I was still a priest, I used to meet with a friend from another denomination, and both of us came to the conclusion that faith schools were an extraordinarily bad idea because they churn out more atheists than anybody else. Yeah. And in fact, you seem to be example. I know this gentleman here. We used to have the secondary school pantomime of having to baptise their children before they went to school. And we just wish that we could deal with the bats so effectively. Baptise them once, you never see them again. Yeah. So, I mean, it's, the more you indoctrinate, in fact, the more actually you turn against things as you get older, when you begin to think, when you realise that there's more than one way of looking at the world.
Yeah. I mean that might be right overall, but even if that is true, we can't adopt a position of supporting indoctrination, because ultimately, I know. But it's something happily that is in our favour, the fact that these things aren't working. Yeah, they are, and it's a bit like collective worship. Actually, so collective worship is something that's not enforced in most schools. And that's used by the religious lobby as an argument for keeping it. They sort of say, oh, there's no point getting rid of it, no one enforces it anyway, and then quietly they allow all of their sort of very religious schools to enforce it quite stringently. So we can't let the fact that our being quite a non-religious and secular country and our having that kind of mindset detract from the fact that our laws are not very secular at all.
I think it might be worth mentioning the fact that of the elephant that isn't in this room. You've just spoken about Christianity. It's worth saying that in Islam, it's probably more of a problem. Islamic schools and an Islamic education is more likely to create someone that wants to keep their religion. Apart from anything else, they have this doctrine of, well, the penalty for wanting to leave your religion is pretty severe. I think it's worth mentioning.
I'm sure I speak for everybody here when I say that I really enjoyed the presentation, and thank you very much for taking the time to come and do it. And probably like a lot of other people, it's going to be something I'll be keen to discuss with people after we leave and in the days to come. So I would like to know, considering that you're very well placed, and you probably have a lot of these type of discussions with people, which arguments and maybe kind of gambits in your experience work well when you're trying to talk to people who might not necessarily come from the same angle on these things as you?
It obviously depends on your argument, on your audience. The thing that I think it's very hard to disagree with is that children should grow up with people from different backgrounds. You don't tend to get many people that disagree with that. When you say that you'd like, children to get the bus to school with a Christian and do their homework with a Hindu and play football at break with a Christian, well, whoever, they don't disagree with that. And so that's something that I'd use, and I use quite effectively. The other thing that's important to stress when you're talking to someone that is inclined to disagree is that when you say you're opposing faith schools, it's not an attack on faith in any way. It's not an attack on religious people. One thing that we try and stress, although it doesn't get heard as much, is that we're not trying to demonise teachers in religious schools. The vast majority of teachers and heads and governors simply try and do the best by their kids and the best by their school, irrespective of what their religion is. So that's important to get out early, so people feel slightly less defensive about the position you're taking. So there's that. There's the whole integration point is good, and then just the discrimination point. If you say to someone, do you think it would be acceptable for a hospital to turn away a non-religious person because they're not religious, or is it acceptable for there to be certain lanes on a motorway that only religious people can use, or seats on a bus, which of course is something that the world has previous with. It's when you talk about the provision of state-funded services only being available to certain groups, that tends to chime with people, because it's the taxpayers' money is something that you hear all the time now, and unfortunately these are schools that are being funded by everyone and they're only available to certain people, and that's something that tends to chime with people. The stuff actually, we say it a lot in sort of parliamentary circles about the socioeconomic stuff, doesn't actually tend to chime with people that much, because it's sort of an indirect effect and they don't really see it, they're not as interested. But if you talk about discrimination, you talk about integration, and you make it clear that you're not demonising people that are just trying to do the best by their kids, you tend to win people over.
I'm kind of following on from 2 points that have just come by. Firstly, there was seems pretty rich hypocrisy to me. There was the outrage earlier this year about the Muslim school in Birmingham, and suddenly this government is trying to polarise our education system, which actually then is to the advantage of the majority white of this country, perhaps. So with that background, I think all of us, for a fair and more equal society, really should be trying to bring forward the arguments and maybe actively campaign. So my question is, are there any active things we can do now, like lobbying, like online petitions, or supporting the BHA through that funding request?
One thing that we're doing at the moment is a take action on writing to your MPs about the latest proposal, the 50% cap proposal. That's an important thing, not only just for getting it on the radar of parliamentarians, but for us. I mean, people send in the replies, and it allows us to get information about what different parliamentarians think about this, because, as I said earlier, it's something that they tend to be quite silent on, if they can be, and so forcing them to take a view is important for us, and it's good information. So if you haven't written to your MPs about this 50% cap thing, please do, and then send us their response. Good. We've set up a really easy. We've got a sort of template letter and sort of different subject boxes, and you can tweak the letter and make it personal in whatever way through our website. It's very easy, and then you just hit send, and all you have to do is type in your postcode, and it'll give you the email address of your MP. It's really, really easy. So I'd encourage you to do that. We're going to be launching soon a way of doing the same with a consultation response. That's slightly more complicated, because whenever we do these things with consultations, the government sees that 90% of people disagree with them, and then say, oh, it's part of a concerted campaign, we're going to ignore it, which is incredibly annoying. But we're going to be doing that soon. And then the other thing, really important thing, is telling us when free school proposals in local areas are being made, because the free school programme is incredibly untransparent, and there's nowhere published that these schools are being proposed, that people are trying to set up schools in areas, and we only find out when they've been approved. We've been in a long-running battle with the Department for Education to get them to release the details of free schools before they're approved, and we've taken them to the Information Commissioner, to Information Tribunal a couple of times, and they keep withholding this information, and it's really quite difficult to find out where these schools are being proposed. So if in a local area you see on a notice board or in a local paper that people are trying to set up a school, drop us an email.
I don't quite agree that we shouldn't demonise faith schools, because in the matter of homosexuality, I think that they are doing appalling damage, particularly sort of Catholic, Muslim and perhaps Jewish schools. I mean, I remember hearing the head or deputy head of a Muslim school saying on the radio, in an ideal world, homosexuals should be put to death. So if you're a child with concerns about you and insecurity about your sexuality, your family isn't sympathetic, and there's nobody in the school at a sort of authority level to give you support, you really are lost.
Yeah, no, I mean, we should demonise faith school. We shouldn't demonise, the point I was making, we shouldn't demonise the people that work in them. And we shouldn't necessarily assume always that people are trying to indoctrinate, and that, obviously we have to call things like that out, and we have to say that you can't have the present situation with all the schools that people think are inclusive, and not have those instances. What I was trying to say is that yes, faith schools are bad, but not all of them are bad, and lots of people, even non-religious people, are forced to send their kids to them, and just when you're trying to have these discussions with them, it's sometimes good to get that across and say, I'm not trying to demonise religious people, I'm not trying to demonise the people that work in these schools, I'm not saying that all schools fail children equally or equivalently, but I'm saying that there needs to be reform if we're going to stop widespread abuses in certain schools.
Thank you very much. It's been a very good, wide-ranging discussion, and a lot of you have participated, which is good. But it just remains for me, on your behalf, to thank Jay for a very informative talk, albeit a very supportive audience, I think.
Yeah.